Hell's Angel dove beneath a TRCK to save a child. What followed brought 2,000 bikers. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and TRN on the notification bell so you'll never miss our channel's new videos. It is free, and the best way to support us in bringing yo more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The afternoon SNHNG low over a quiet highway outside a small American town where the air smelled faintly of warm asphalt and distant pine trees. Traffic moved slowly through the intersection near a roadside diner that had served truckers and travelers for decades. Families crossed the street with grocery bags. A delivery driver leaned against his van sipping coffee. Nothing about the moment hinted that within seconds the entire scene would change forever. The deep thunder of a motorcycle engine rolled down the road like distant thunder. The rider was a broad-shouldered man named Cole Maddox, a weathered biker known among the few who recognized the faded patch on his leather vest as a former member of the Hells Angels Brotherhood. His beard carried streaks of gray and his eyes had the quiet watchfulness of someone who had seen too much life on long empty highways. Cole slowed his motorcycle as he approached the intersection, sensing movement ahead. Across the street a young girl stepped off the CRB, chasing a bright red balloon that had slipped from her small hand. Her name was Emily Carter, and she could not have been more than 8 years old. The balloon drifted across the lane, pled by a playful GST of wind, and the girl followed Whithot, noticing the enormous freight Terce barreling toward the intersection. The driver leaned on the horn BT, the heavy vehicle cold, not stop quickly. The sound shattered the calm afternoon. People turned their heads at once. A woman near the diner gasped and shouted for the child to stop. Tires screamed against the pavement as the TRCK driver fought desperately to slow the massive machine. BT momentum shed the vehicle forward like an unstoppable wall of steel. In that fraction of a moment, the entire street froze. Emily stood in the road, confused by the sten. Noise, the balloon twisting in the air above her. Cole Maddox saw everything with terrifying clarity. The distance between the child and the TRCK closed with every heartbeat. Without hesitation, he twisted the throttle and launched his motorcycle forward. The engine roared as he sped toward the intersection, abandoning all thought of his own safety. People later said the biker moved faster than seemed possible, as if instinct had taken control of his body. He dropped the motorcycle sideways before it reached the girl and dove from the seat. His arms wrapped around the child as he pled her down and rolled across the pavement. BT, the TRCK, was already there, towering above them, its massive shadow swallowing the sunlight. Witnesses would remember the moment in stunned silence as the biker dragged the girl beneath the towering frame of the TRCK, pressing his body flat against the asphalt to shield her. The TRCK thundered overhead, metal rattling and wind rushing beneath its chassis. For several terrifying seconds nobody could see what had happened beneath the roaring vehicle. When the TRCK finally screeched to a halt, the street fell into an eerie silence. The motorcycle lay on its side in the road, the red balloon drifted slowly poured into the bright sky, and the man who had leaped beneath the TRCK was nowhere to be seen. The entire street remained frozen in a silence that felt heavier than the roar of the TRCK that had just passed. For a long breath nobody moved. The freight TRCK stood diagonally across the intersection, its engine still rumbling like a distant storm, while the smell of burned rubber drifted through the warm afternoon air. People stared at the ground beneath the towering vehicle, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. A waitress from the roadside diner stepped forward slowly with her hand pressed against her mouth. The delivery driver who had been leaning against his van walked closer into the street, his eyes wide with disbelief. Everyone had seen the biker dive beneath the massive TRCK while holding the small girl in his arms. BT, now neither of them could be seen. The driver of the TRCK finally shed open his door and climbed down from the tall cab, his boots hitting the pavement with a hollow sound. His face was pale and shaken. He looked toward the crowd and spoke with a trembling voice, asking if anyone had seen where the child had gone. BT, nobody answered. Their attention remained fixed on the dark shadow beneath the TRCK. The driver walked around the front of the vehicle slowly, as if afraid of what he might discover. A man from the crowd dropped to one knee and leaned forward, trying to look beneath the long trailer BT. The heavy steel frame blocked most of the view. The seconds stretched into a painful silence. A woman whispered that the biker had to be gone, that no one could survive something like that. Another voice insisted that the child must have rolled clear before the TRCK passed overhead. Nobody knew the TRTH, and that uncertainty HNG over the street like a storm clod. Then someone shouted from the opposite side of the TRCK. The voice was sharp and urgent. People rushed toward the sound. A middle-aged mechanic from a nearby auto shop had crouched low enough to peer beneath the trailer. His voice trembled with disbelief as he called OT to the others. "There is someone under there." The crowd gathered quickly, forming a wide circle around the enormous TRCK. The mechanic slid flat onto the pavement, so he could see more clearly. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke again slowly, almost as if he did not trust his own eyes. "The biker is under the TRCK, and he is holding the little girl." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several people fell to their knees trying to look beneath the long metal frame. The space between the pavement and the TRCK was narrow, barely enough for a person to fit. Yet there he was. Cole Maddox lay flat against the asphalt, his broad body pressed close to the ground. One arm wrapped protectively around Emily Carter, while his other hand shielded the back of her head. The girl was TCKD safely against his chest, her small fingers gripping the front of his leather vest. DST from the road CLNG to both of them BT, they were alive. A police officer who had been directing traffic half a block away ran toward the scene as someone called emergency services. The officer dropped down beside the mechanic and carefully leaned forward to look beneath the TRCK. For a long moment he remained silent, studying the scene. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of shock and quiet respect. "They are both alive." The words moved through the crowd like a wave of relief. Some people wiped tears from their eyes, while others simply stood frozen, trying to comprehend the courage it must have taken for a man to dive beneath a moving freight TRCK to protect a child he had never met. Beneath the TRCK, Cole Maddox remained perfectly still, waiting for the danger to pass. The fender of the engine above him slowly faded as the driver SHD the vehicle down. In the sten quiet, Emily looked at the RGGD face of the man who had saved her life. Her voice was small and shaky BT, clear enough for Cole to hear. "Mister, are we safe now?" Cole felt the pounding of his own heartbeat begin to slow. He nodded gently, thought the child could barely see the movement in the narrow space beneath the TRCK. "Yes, little one," he said softly. "You are safe now." Above them, the first distant wail of an ambulance siren began to echo through the town, signaling that help was finally on the way. The first ambulance siren grew louder as it rushed through the streets of the small town, echoing off storefront windows and parked cars. People stepped back from the massive freight TRCK, creating space as police officers began directing traffic away from the intersection. The officer who had first looked beneath the TRCK lay flat on the pavement once more, speaking calmly to the man beneath the steel frame. "Cole Maddox, can you hear me?" The officer had noticed the name stitched faintly on the inside collar of the biker's worn leather vest. Cole nodded slowly, thought the officer could barely see the movement. "I hear you," he answered in a steady voice. The officer glanced at the child TCKD safely against Cole's chest. Emily Carter was trembling BT alert, her wide eyes fixed on the man who had shielded her when the TRCK thundered above them. The officer spoke again, keeping his tone calm so the girl would not panic. "We are going to get both of you OT of there. JST, stay still for another moment." Around the TRCK, several firefighters had already arrived with the first emergency response vehicle. They examined the citation carefully, measuring the distance between the pavement and the heavy frame of the trailer. One firefighter shook his head in quiet disbelief. The space was barely more than a foot high, JST enough for someone lying flat to survive the passage of the TRCK overhead. Another responder whispered that the biker must have calculated the risk in a single heartbeat. Cole lay perfectly still beneath the vehicle, his arms still wrapped protectively around Emily. He could feel the small rise and fall of her breathing against his chest. Her tiny fingers still clutched his vest, as if letting go might bring the danger back again. The roar of the TRCK engine had faded, replaced by the distant sounds of radios crackling and emergency workers speaking in careful voices. Emily finally whispered another question. Mister, is the big TRCK gone now? Cole glanced toward the metal underside of the trailer that still loomed above them like a ceiling of steel. Yes, he said gently. The TRCK is stopped. Yo did exactly what I asked Yo to do. Yo stayed very still. That was very brave. The girl nodded slowly. Thought tears still glistened in her eyes. She studied the RGGD face above her. Cole Maddox had the look of a man shaped by years on the road. His beard was rock and streaked with gray. A faint scar crossed one cheek, and the leather vest he wore carried the faded markings of long miles and hard weather. Yet his voice remained calm and warm as he spoke to her. Above them, firefighters carefully placed heavy stabilizing blocks around the wheels of the TRCK to ensure the massive vehicle would not shift even an inch. One responder slid a flashlight beneath the trailer to check the narrow space again. The beam of light illuminated the scene clearly now. Cole Maddox lay flat against the pavement, his body positioned between the child and the hard metal edges of the TRCK frame. His shoulders had taken the BRNT of the impact when he rolled beneath the vehicle, and the sleeve of his shirt was torn where it had scraped against the asphalt. Yet he had not released his protective hold on the girl for even a moment. The firefighter looked at the others and nodded with quiet respect. He saved her by taking the entire risk himself. The police officer lying near the edge of the TRCK spoke again. Cole, we are going to slide you. OT slowly. I need you to keep holding the child till we say otherwise. Understood? Cole answered with a simple word. Understood. Several firefighters positioned themselves along the side of the TRCK, while another carefully jigged a protective board beneath the narrow space. Inch by inch, they began the careful process of bringing the biker and the child back into the daylight. The crowd held its breath as the first movement appeared beneath the long shadow of the trailer. Slowly, the broad shoulders of Cole Maddox emerged from under the TRCK, followed by the small figure of Emily Carter, still wrapped safely in his arms. As the two of them were finally pled free into the sunlight, a wave of relief swept through the gathered crowd. Some people applauded while others simply stared in awe at the man who had risked everything in a single fearless moment to protect a child he had never met. The sound of applause rippled through the intersection as Cole Maddox finally rose to his feet, still holding Emily Carter carefully in his arms. The bright afternoon sun reflected off the windows of nearby stores and the chrome of parked vehicles. For a moment, the entire crowd seemed focused on one simple TRTH. The child was alive. A paramedic stepped forward quickly, carrying a medical bag, and speaking in a calm voice meant to reassure both the child and the man who had saved her. Let us take a look at the little one. Cole gently knelt and lowered Emily onto the stretcher the paramedics had rolled beside him. Even as he did, the girl kept her hands wrapped around the front of his leather vest. Her fingers trembled slightly, and she stared at his face as if trying to understand who he really was. One of the paramedics began checking her pulse and shining a small light across her eyes to make sure she had not suffered a concoction. Emily remained quiet. Her eyes moved constantly between the strangers around her and the biker who had shielded her beneath the tierce. A woman thinly shed through the crowd, shouting the child's name. Emily. Emily Carter. The girl turned her head instantly and cried OT with relief. Mommy. Rachel Carter shed forward with tears streaming down her cheeks. She dropped beside the stretcher and wrapped her arms around her daughter with a fierce embrace that made several people in the crowd wipe their own eyes. Rachel kept repeating the same words again and again as she held the girl close. You're safe. You're safe. The paramedic gently explained that the child appeared unharmed. They would still take her to the hospital for a FLL examination. Rachel nodded gratefully before finally looking toward the man who stood a few feet away, brushing DST from his torn sleeve. Cole Maddox had stepped back quietly, as if hoping to disappear into the background now that the crisis had passed. Rachel approached him slowly. Her voice shook with emotion as she tried to find the right words. Yo saved my daughter. I do not even know how to thank yo. Cole shifted his weight slightly and gave a small shake of his head. No thanks needed, ma'am. She just needed someone to move fast. Emily had sat slightly on the stretcher and now watched the exchange with wide eyes. The adrenaline of the moment had faded and a new feeling had taken its place. Certainty. Her gaze moved slowly across Cole's tall frame, taking in the heavy boots, the worn leather vest, and the faded patch sewn across the back. Thought the words were partly hidden by years of wear. The name of the motorcycle CLB could still be recognized by anyone familiar with that symbol. Hells Angels. Emily had heard adults mention the name before in kayak conversations and television stories. In her young mind, the image of a biker with tattoos and a dark leather vest had always seemed frightening. The man standing in front of her looked exactly like those stories had described. When Cole stepped closer to check on her, the girl instinctively pled the blanket around her shoulders and leaned slightly toward her mother. The movement was small but impossible to miss. Cole noticed it immediately. He paused where he stood and crouched slightly, so he would not appear as tall and imposing. His voice softened as he spoke. "Hey kid, you did real good back there." Emily looked at him carefully, trying to reconcile the gentle voice with the intimidating appearance. Her small voice came barely above a whisper. "You are not going to HRT me, are you?" The question hung in the air with innocent honesty. Several people nearby fell silent as they heard the child speak. Cole's expression changed in a way that revealed something deeper beneath the RGD exterior. The corners of his eyes softened, and he slowly shook his head. "No, little one. I would never HRT yo. I just wanted to make SRE yo state safe." Emily studied his face for another moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the moment he wrapped his arms around her beneath the terrace. "Why did you help me?" Cole glanced briefly toward the road, where his motorcycle still lay on its side, near the intersection. The memory of the moment flashed through his mind like lightning. He looked back at the girl and answered quietly, "Because sometimes the right thing to do is the only thing that matters." Emily continued watching Cole Maddox with the careful curiosity that only a child could have after experiencing something frightening. The noise of the emergency vehicles and the murmuring crowd faded into the background as paramedics finished their kick examination. One of them wrapped a light blanket around her shoulders while another checked the small scrapes on Cole's arm, where the pavement had torn through his sleeve. Cole barely noticed the sting of antiseptic as the medic cleaned the scrape. His eyes had drifted back to the road where his motorcycle still rested on its side, chrome reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. The scene in front of him began to blur as another memory surfaced in his mind, a memory he had carried for years like a shadow that never left. Long before that afternoon in the Kayat Town intersection, Cole Maddox had lived a very different life on the endless highways of the western states. He had spent decades riding with the brotherhood of hardened bikers who called themselves family on the road. The roar of engines, the long rides across deserts and mountain passes, and the quiet loyalty of men who trusted each other with their lives had once defined everything he was. Yet there had also been another life waiting at home whenever the road ended. In a small house outside a DSDY town in Nevada, there had once been a little girl who ran to greet him every time he pled into the driveway. Her name had been Lily Maddox. She had loved bright balloons and summer afternoons and the deep rumble of her father's motorcycle. When she was very young, she said to climb onto the seat of the bike while Cole lifted her carefully so she could pretend to ride. Those memories had once been the brightest part of his life. One afternoon many years ago, everything had changed in a moment that still haunted him. Cole had been hundreds of miles away on a long ride with the CLB when the call came. A distracted driver had missed a stop sign near the edge of town. The small family car that carried Lily and her grandmother had never had a chance. By the time Cole reached the hospital, the hallways were silent, and the waiting room lights had dimmed. The doctors had tried everything they could. The accident had taken the most important piece of his world. Since that night, the sound of a child's laughter had always carried a weight in Cole's heart that few people could understand. He had continued riding because the road was the only place where the memories did not feel cheetahs so heavy. Yet every time he saw a child near a BSY road or heard the squeal of tires on pavement, his instincts sharpened instantly. He knew too well how quickly a single careless moment could destroy a family. The voice of the paramedic finally brought him back to the present. "Sir, you should have that shoulder checked at the hospital JST to be safe." Cole gave a quiet nod. His eyes returned to Emily, who still sat on the stretcher beside her mother. The girl had been watching him during the entire exchange. Children often sense things that adults missed. Emily tilted her head slightly, as she studied the biker's expression. "You look sad," she said gently. Cole seemed surprised by the observation. Rachel Carter placed a protective arm around her daughter BT, allowed the conversation to continue. Cole crouched beside the stretcher, so he could meet Emily at eye level again. "Sometimes grown PS carry old memories," he answered softly. "BT, today is a good day because you're safe." Emily thought about that answer carefully. Then she reached OT and placed her small hand against the rock leather of his vest. "Thank you for saving me," she said with simple sincerity. For a moment Cole Maddox could not speak. The late afternoon sunlight stretched long. Shadows across the intersection and the quiet gratitude in the child's voice filled a space in his heart that had been empty for many years. In that moment he realized that the past could never be changed. BT, sometimes the future offered a chance to protect someone else when it mattered most. The quiet gratitude in Emily Carter's voice lingered in the air long after she spoke. And for a moment the BSY intersection felt strangely peaceful despite the flashing emergency lights and the cluster of police vehicles blocking the road. Cole Maddox slowly stood from his crouched position beside the stretcher. The simple words of the child had stirred something deep within him, something he had spent years trying not to feel. Around them the scene continued to unfold as officers spoke with witnesses and firefighters inspected the long freight TRCK that still stood across the intersection. The driver of the TRCK sat on the CRB with a blanket around his shoulders while an officer asked careful questions about what had happened in the seconds before the near disaster. A small crowd remained gathered behind the police barrier, many people holding their phones after recording the dramatic moment when the biker had dived beneath the TRCK. Some of them were already replaying the footage in disbelief. One of the officers reviewing the citation walked slowly toward the truck's front wheels. He studied the long skid marks that stretched across the pavement. They ran in a crooked line for more than 100 feet, a clear sign that the driver had tried desperately to stop the heavy vehicle before it reached the intersection. Yet something about the pattern made the officer pause. He crouched and ran his hand along the black marks brunette into the asphalt. The pattern was uneven, as if one set of brakes had responded slower than the others. A mechanic from the nearby auto shop stepped closer and examined the same marks with a thoughtful expression. "That TRCK should have stopped sooner," he muttered quietly. The officer looked P. "What makes you say that?" The mechanic pointed toward the wheels and then toward the long trailer. "A rig that size carries a FLL braking system on every axle. When the driver hits the brakes you see more even marks across the road. This one looks strange." The officer stood slowly, his expression sharpening with interest. He walked to the side of the TRCK and signaled for another officer to assist him. Together they inspected the heavy metal hosing around the rear wheel assembly. One officer leaned closer and shined a flashlight into the mechanism beneath the trailer. After a moment he frowned and called his partner over. "Something is wrong here." Several firefighters joined them as the inspection continued. One of the responders carefully traced a line along a section of the brake assembly where the metal casing appeared scratched and bent. It looked as though someone had tampered with the system before the TRCK ever reached the intersection. The driver overheard the conversation and looked P in confusion. "Tampered with it?" he asked. "That TRCK passed inspection this morning before I left the depot." The officers exchanged serious glances. If the brakes had failed completely, the TRCK might not have slowed at all. Yet the Nevin skid marks suggested something else. It was as if part of the braking system had been weakened, BT, not completely disabled. Enough to delay the stop by JST a few cryoseconds. Meanwhile, the paramedics had been preparing Emily for transport to the hospital for a routine examination. Rachel Carter stood beside the stretcher holding her daughter's hand while quietly thanking the emergency crew. Cole Maddox walked a few steps toward his fallen motorcycle and lifted it upright with a practiced motion. The engine was silent now, BT. The machine still carried the warmth of the ride that had brought him there. As he checked the handlebars for damage, one of the officers approached him. The officer's voice carried a tone that mixed gratitude with concern. "Mr. Maddox, we may need you to remain nearby for a little while. There are some details about this incident that do not look like a simple accident." Cole trended slightly toward the TRCK, where the officers continued their careful inspection. A faint crease appeared between his brows. "What kind of details?" The officer glanced back toward the freight vehicle before answering quietly. The brakes on that TRCK might not have failed by chance. Someone may have interfered with them before the TRCK reached this road. Cole followed the officer's gaze toward the towering vehicle that had nearly taken a child's life. The afternoon sunlight glinted off the metal surface while investigators continued to examine the damaged brake housing. In that moment, a troubling thought began to form. If the TRCK had not stopped in time by accident, then the near tragedy at the intersection might not have been an accident at all. The officer's quiet words about the truck's brakes lingered in the air like an approaching storm. Cole Maddox stood beside his motorcycle watching the investigators work the towering freight TRCK. The afternoon sunlight had been to soften toward evening, and long shadows stretched across the intersection where only in her earlier life had nearly been lost. Police officers placed bright orange markers along the pavement where the Nevin skid marks carved a dark path across the road. One investigator photographed the damaged brake housing while another spoke with the shaken driver again, asking the same questions from different angles. The driver repeated that the TRCK had passed inspection that very morning at the transport depot outside town. He had noticed nothing foul when he began the road. Meanwhile, the small crowd of witnesses had grown larger. News of the dramatic arrest spread quickly through nearby neighborhoods, and people gathered behind the police barrier, hoping to glimpse the man who had dived beneath the TRCK to save a child. Several reporters arrived with cameras and microphones, their vehicles pling pee along the edge of the blocked street. One reporter pointed toward Cole as she spoke quietly to her cameraman. That must be him, the biker who saved the girl. The cameraman zoomed in as Cole lifted his helmet from the ground and BRSDST from its surface. The faded leather vest he wore carried the unmistakable emblem that many Americans recognized even if they had never seen it peek close. The wings and SKLL of the Hell's Angels Brotherhood had long been a symbol that stirred both fascination and cat-eye wherever it appeared. As the camera lens focused on that patch, several people in the crowd began whispering among themselves. A few of them looked at Cole with new curiosity. One older man inched his friend and spoke under his breath. I have not seen that patch errant here in years. Another woman nodded slowly. My brother rode with a chapter OT West. They say the ones who wear that patch are loyal for life. The reporters approached the police line hoping to speak with Cole BT. An officer held his hand to keep them back while the investigation continued. The officer who had first spoken to Cole returned from the TRCK with a more serious expression now. He walked directly toward the biker and stopped a few feet away. Mr. Maddox, we are still examining the braking system BT. It looks more complicated than we thought. Some of the components appear to have been loosened deliberately. Cole listened carefully while resting one hand on the seat of his motorcycle. The words did not surprise him as they might have earlier in life. Years on the road had taught him that accidents were not always what they seemed. Are you saying someone wanted that TRCK to fail? He asked quietly. The officer nodded once. It is possible. We will not know for certain till the mechanical team finishes their inspection BT. The evidence suggests interference. At that moment, Rachel Carter stepped closer with Emily beside her. The girl had insisted on walking rather than riding the stretcher, and the paramedics allowed it after confirming she was unharmed. Emily looked from the officer to Cole, and then toward the Hage TRCK that had nearly STRCK her. Why would someone do that? She asked softly. Rachel placed a comforting arm around her daughter's shoulders. The officer hesitated before answering. Sometimes machines fail because of mistakes, and sometimes because of people making bad choices. That is what we are trying to understand. Cole glanced again toward the TRCK, and then toward the line of reporters waiting beyond the police barrier. He knew how quickly stories could grow once cameras and microphones arrived. A dramatic arrest already had the attention of the town. If the incident turned out to be something more than an accident, it would draw even greater attention. Then a young officer hurried toward them holding a tablet counter that displayed a passed video frame. Sir, you should see this, he said to the investigator. The screen showed footage from a traffic camera positioned above the intersection. The image captured the moment seconds before the TRCK entered the crossing. In the frame, another vehicle could be seen briefly passing beside the freight TRCK near the edge of the road. The officer tapped the screen and zoomed closer. The license plate of that vehicle was partially visible. The investigator studied the image and then looked toward Cole with a thoughtful expression. It appears the TRCK was not the only vehicle involved in what happened here today. Cole followed the officer's gaze to the screen where the mysterious vehicle lingered frozen in the video frame. A quiet tension settled over the scene as everyone realized the same unsettling possibility. The near tragedy at the intersection might have been only part of a much larger story. The image frozen on the tablet screen drew the attention of everyone standing near the police vehicles. The officer holding the device zoomed in further while the investigator studied the BLRRY frame with growing concentration. The passing vehicle beside the freight TRCK appeared only for a brief moment in the footage, yet it was enough to reveal something Sal. The dark sedan had slowed almost perfectly beside the TRCK before accelerating away just seconds before the TRCK reached the intersection. The partial license plate glowed faintly on the screen, though several of the embers remained hidden by glare. The investigator turned the tablet slightly, so Cole Maddox could see the image more clearly. The biker leaned forward, his weathered face thoughtful as he studied the frozen moment. "It looks like someone was pacing the TRCK," he said quietly. The officer nodded. "That is exactly what it looks like." Another officer radioed the plate fragment to dispatch, asking if any nearby traffic cameras had captured the vehicle from another angle. Within minutes the answer returned through the crackling radio. A camera at the next intersection had recorded the same sedan turning sharply onto a side street just after the near collision. The investigator folded his arms as he processed the information. Whoever was driving that car knew exactly where the TRCK would be. Meanwhile, reporters had been broadcasting the story from the sidewalk beyond the police barrier. The dramatic rest had already reached local news stations, and clips of the event were spreading quickly across the internet. One witness had captured the moment Cole dove beneath the TRCK and uploaded the video only minutes after it happened. Phones across the town now displayed the same astonishing scene again and again. In the video, a powerful motorcycle skidded sideways across the pavement while the biker leaped forward and wrapped his arms around the child. The TRCK thundered overhead as bystanders shouted in shock. Within a short time, the footage began appearing on national news feeds and social media platforms. Commentators described the known biker as a hero who risked his life for a stranger. Yet the story grew more complicated when another frame from the video revealed the faded patch on Cole Maddox's vest. Viewers quickly recognized the emblem of the Hell's Angels Brotherhood. The combination of a fearless rest and the presence of a biker known to belong to one of the most legendary motorcycle CLBs in the United States captured the public imagination immediately. Some viewers praised the courage of the man who had saved the child, while others wondered what story might lie behind the quiet rider with the weathered face. Back at the intersection, the investigators continued reviewing the footage from the traffic camera. The dark sedan remained their most important CLE. The investigator pointed to the frame again and spoke thoughtfully. If the brakes on that TRCK were tampered with, then whoever did it may have wanted to make sure the vehicle reached this intersection at exactly the right moment. Cole considered the idea carefully. "You mean someone planned the timing?" he asked. The officer nodded slowly. "It is possible. The TRCK slows here because of the traffic light. If the brakes delayed even a few seconds, it would arrive at the crossing right when pedestrians stepped into the street." Rachel Carter held her daughter close as she listened to the conversation. The thought that the near tragedy might not have been random sent a chill through her. Emily looked at her mother and then at Cole. "Was someone trying to HRT the TRCK driver?" she asked. The investigator shook his head slightly. "We do not know yet. We are beginning to believe this incident was not simply a mechanical failure." At that moment, the officer monitoring the radio received another message from dispatch. He listened carefully and then looked toward the investigator with a serious expression. They just identified the vehicle from another camera a few blocks away. "The dark sedan belongs to a man who lives outside town." The investigator asked the obvious question. "What is his connection to the TRCK?" The officer glanced briefly toward Cole before answering. "According to the records, he does not have a connection to the TRCK at all. However, he does have a history with someone else who happened to be standing at this intersection today." Cole felt the weight of the officer's words before they were even finished. The investigator turned slowly toward him. "Mr. Maddox, it appears the man who owns that sedan once had serious trouble with a motorcycle CLB many years ago. Cole did not speak BT. The faint tightening of his jaw suggested he understood exactly which CLB the officer meant. The tightening of Cole Maddox's jaw did not go noticed by the officers standing nearby. For several long seconds, the BSY intersection seemed to fall into a tense silence again as the weight of the new information settled over everyone present. The investigator held the tablet carefully while the frozen frame of the dark sedan remained visible on the screen. He studied Cole with a more foxed expression now, as though seeing the quiet biker in an entirely new light. Mr. Maddox, the officer said calmly, "We are not making accusations. We are simply following the information that is coming in. BT, it appears the owner of that vehicle has a past that intersects with the same motorcycle CLB represented on your vest." Cole remained still beside his motorcycle. The warm evening air brushed lightly against the worn leather of his vest, while distant voices of reporters and witnesses conned behind the police barrier. His eyes remained on the tablet screen for a moment longer before he finally spoke. "What is the name of the driver?" The officer glanced at the tablet again. "According to vehicle registration, the car belongs to a man named Victor Hale." The name HNG in the air like a distant echo from another time. Cole did not react immediately. BT, something in his poster changed slightly. Years of experience on the road had taught him how to keep his thoughts hidden from strangers. The investigator noticed the subtle shift and continued speaking carefully. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Cole took a slow breath and looked back toward the officers. "A long time ago," he said quietly, "there was a man with that name who had business with the CLB. It was not good business." Rachel Carter listened to the exchange while keeping Emily close beside her. She cold sensed the tension building around the adults, even thought message of the conversation carried meanings she did not FLLY understand. Emily looked from one face to another, trying to follow the story unfolding around her. Cole continued after a moment of silence. "Years back, Victor Hale ran a transport company that moved freight across several states. One of his trucks was caught carrying stolen parts. The investigation connected the shipment to people who had crossed the CLB in a very serious way." The officer listened carefully. "What happened to him?" Cole shrggd slightly. "The law took care of most of it. Hale lost his contracts and his business collapsed. Last I heard, he blamed the CLB for everything that followed." The investigator folded his arms thoughtfully. "If this is the same man, then it is possible he has been holding on to that resentment for a long time." Cole nodded once. "Some men carry grudges like they are carrying fuel. It only takes a spark to light them." Behind them, the crowd of reporters had grown even larger as word of the investigation spread through the town. Camera crews filmed the damaged TRCK and interviewed witnesses who described the incredible moment when the biker had leaped beneath the moving vehicle. Some of the witnesses repeated the same detail again and again. The biker never hesitated. He moved before anyone else even understood what was happening. The story was already spreading beyond the town through television broadcasts and online news feeds. Within minutes, people across the country were watching the video of the arrests. Many viewers recognized the worn patch on Cole's vest and began sharing the footage across biker communities and online forums connected to motorcycle culture. Messages traveled quickly along those digital highways. One particular video clip reached a quiet garage hundreds of miles away where a group of riders stood around a long wooden workbench covered with tools. One of the men replayed the clip several times while the others watched in silence. The moment when Cole Maddox dove beneath the TRCK filled the small screen again and again. Finally, one of the older riders spoke in a low voice. "That is Iron Cole Maddox. I will know that ride anywhere." Another man nodded slowly. "Word will spread fast once the brothers see this." Back at the intersection, the investigator finished writing a few notes before addressing Cole again. "Mr. Maddox, if Victor Hale holds a GRDG against your former CLB, it is possible he tried to case an accident involving one of its members. BT, according to the footage, the TRCK never SDRCK yo. It nearly SDRCK the child instead." Cole looked toward Emily, who stood quietly beside her mother. His voice carried a calm certainty when he answered. "If Hale set that TRCK loose today, he did not care who it hit." The investigator studied the scene around them once more as the evening sun dipped lower behind the buildings. In the distance, the first rumble of approaching motorcycles could be heard somewhere beyond the far end of the highway, faint but unmistakable, like thunder beginning to roll across the horizon. The faint rumble that rolled across the distant highway at first sounded like ordinary traffic moving beyond the edge of town. Yet within seconds the sound deepened into something heavier and unmistakable. It was the steady thunder of multiple motorcycle engines approaching together, their rhythm echoing off the buildings and storefront windows that lined the quiet streets. Several people in the gathered crowd turned their heads toward the direction of the sound. A young reporter lowered her microphone and glanced down the road with curiosity. "That does not sound like JST-1 motorcycle," she murmured to her cameraman. The investigator standing beside Cole Maddox heard it as well. His eyes narrowed slightly while he listened to the rising chores of engines growing louder with every passing moment. Cole remained still beside his motorcycle. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly in a knowing expression. He had spent decades on the road listening to the language of engines. To most people the approaching rumble might sound like chaos. To a rider it carried a pattern that could not be mistaken. "That is not traffic," he said quietly. The investigator looked at him. "Then what is it?" Cole turned his gaze toward the highway at the far end of the street. "That is a grop ride. A big one." The sound grew stronger until the pavement itself seemed to vibrate beneath the weight of it. People behind the police barrier stepped closer to the edge of the sidewalk, trying to see what was coming. A moment later, the first motorcycles appeared at the far end of the road. The riders moved in a tight formation that stretched across the lane like a rolling wave of chrome and leather. Their headlights formed a bright line against the fading evening light, while the roar of their engines filled the entire intersection. One police officer instinctively stepped forward as if preparing to direct traffic. He quickly realized the riders were already slowing as they approached the blocked intersection. The lead motorcycle rolled forward till it reached the police vehicles and then came to a controlled stop. The rider lifted his visor slowly. His leather vest carried the same worn emblem that rested on Cole Maddox's shoulders. Behind him more motorcycles continued to arrive. Dozens of them. Then more. The long line of riders stretched back along the highway farther than anyone Cole immediately caught. Some of the reporters stared in amazement while their cameras turned toward the growing procession. One of them whispered into her microphone, "We are witnessing something extraordinary here tonight. It appears a large group of bikers has arrived at the scene of the race." The investigator watched the riders gather with a mixture of cat-eye and fascination. Many of the men wore the same distinctive patches that marked them as members of the same brotherhood. Others carried different symbols. BT nodded respectfully toward the first group as they parked their motorcycles along the roadside. The sound of engines shouting down spread through the area one machine at a time, till the street that had been filled with thunder only moments earlier settled into a heavy silence again. The lead rider stepped off his motorcycle and removed his helmet. He was an older man with deep lines across his face and eyes that had clearly spent years watching the long American highways roll beneath two wheels. He looked directly at Cole Maddox and gave a slow nod of recognition. "News travels fast on the road," he said in a calm voice that carried easily across the quiet street. "We saw what happened today." Cole crossed the short distance between them and returned the nod. "Did not expect word to spread that quickly," he replied. The older rider gestured toward the line of motorcycles that now filled the roadside for nearly half a mile. The video reached every chapter before the SN finished setting. "When one of our own does something like that," the road answers. Rachel Carter watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and confusion. Emily clutched her mother's hand as she stared at the long line of riders. The investigator stepped closer to Cole and lowered his voice. "How many people are we looking at here?" Cole glanced back along the highway where more headlights were still approaching. "In the distance." His answer was quiet. BT certain. "This is only the beginning. If the message keeps spreading there will be far more riders here before morning." The line of motorcycles continued to grow as the evening sky deepened into shades of amber and blue above the quiet town. Headlights stretched down the highway like a glowing river while the steady rumble of engines rolled through the streets. People standing behind the police barrier watched in astonishment as more riders arrived in disciplined formation. One by one the motorcycles slowed, turned carefully along the roadside, and parked beside the others already waiting. The chrome and black leather seemed endless. Police officers exchanged uncertain glances while trying to maintain order around the intersection. Yet despite the overwhelming number of riders, there was no chaos. Each motorcycle stopped with calm precision, and each rider stepped off quietly, removing helmets and surveying the scene with serious respect. The older rider who had first spoken to Cole Maddox tread slowly and raised his hand toward the arriving motorcycles. It was a simple signal. The effect was immediate. The engines that were still idling fell silent one after another, till the only sound left was the soft ticking of cooling metal. The quiet that followed felt almost ceremonial. The investigator standing beside the police cruiser stared down the long road where the motorcycles now filled both sides of the street. His voice came low with disbelief. "How many riders are there?" Cole glanced toward the distant line of headlights still approaching the town. "By the time they all arrive, there will be but 2,000 of them," he said calmly. The officer blinked slowly as he processed the number. 2,000 riders gathering in one place was something this small town had never witnessed before. Rachel Carter held Emily close as they both looked at the sea of motorcycles stretching across the evening light. The little girl had never seen anything like it. "Mommy," she whispered, "are all these people his friends?" Rachel hesitated before answering. Cole heard the question and stepped closer. "They are not just friends," he said gently. "They are brothers of the road." The older rider who had greeted Cole earlier walked toward Rachel and Emily with careful respect. His presence was large and weathered. His voice carried a quiet kindness. "Little one," he said softly. "To Emily, we heard what happened today. What this man did for you." Emily looked at him with wide Creole's eyes. "He saved me from the TRCK, she explained simply. The older rider nodded slowly and then looked back at Cole. "That is exactly what we heard." Word spread across the country faster than any of us expected. Every chapter heard the story before the SN finished setting. He gestured toward the long line of riders filling the road. So they came. Some drove all afternoon. Some rode through the night. All for the same reason. The investigator stepped forward carefully. "And what reason would that be?" The older rider answered with hot hesitation. "Respect. When a rider risks his life to protect someone who cannot protect themselves, it means something to the brotherhood. That kind of courage travels fast along the highways." Cameras from the gathered reporters captured the moment as the thousands of riders stood beside their motorcycles in quiet solidarity. The image spread through news broadcasts across the country, while commentators described the extraordinary gathering taking place in the small town. Some viewers expected the riders to create chaos or confrontation. Instead, they stood peacefully beside the road, watching over the intersection where the rest had happened. The investigator tread toward Cole again. "This is Cheetah, a response for one act of bravery." Cole shruggled slightly, as if the attention made him comfortable. "It is not about me," he said quietly. "It is about what the road teaches us. You'll look after the people who cannot look after themselves." Emily tgged gently on his sleeve. "Are they all here because of me?" she asked. Cole crouched beside her, so their eyes were level again. "They are here because today reminded them what really matters." The older rider stepped forward once more and placed a firm hand on Cole's shoulder. "The Brotherhood does not forget moments like this," he said. "Tonight these roads belong to the riders who came to honor what you did. Until this citation with that TRCK and the man behind it is FLOY understood, you will not stand alone." The quiet statement from the older rider settled over the crowd like a solemn promise. The long line of motorcycles remained still along the roadside while the evening air cooled and the last light of sunset faded behind the buildings. Those sands of riders stood beside their machines, their silhouettes stretching across the pavement under the glow of street lamps that had been to flicker on one by one. The atmosphere was not loud or chaotic as many might have expected. Instead, it carried the calm weight of respect. Cole Maddox stood beside Emily and her mother, watching the rows of riders who had traveled from distant highways to stand at that very intersection. For a man who had spent most of his life riding alone between long miles of desert and mountain roads, the sight carried a meaning deeper than words. Emily looked at the sea of motorcycles again, and then back at Cole. Her small voice broke the silence gently. "That is a lot of people." Cole nodded with a faint smile. "Yes, little one, it is." The girl hesitated for a moment, and then stepped forward. With hot warning, she wrapped her arms around Cole's waist in a kick sincere HG. For a brief moment the toque rider seemed completely unprepared for the simple gesture. His arms hovered awkwardly before he slowly returned the embrace, careful not to squeeze too tightly. The reporters nearby captured the quiet moment as cameras flashed and recorded the scene. The image of the small girl hugging the RJD biker spread instantly through the gathered crowd and across the news cameras broadcasting live to viewers across the country. Emily pled back slightly and looked at him with bright eyes. "I am really glad you were there today," she said. Cole felt a tightness in his chest that surprised him more than the roar of any engine ever had. For years he had carried the memory of the daughter he had lost, believing that the road was the only place left where he belonged. Yet standing in that intersection with the gratitude of a child and the silent respect of those sands of riders surrounding him, something inside him shifted. He knelt again so he could speak to Emily at eye level. "Today you reminded a lot of people that looking OT for one another still matters," he said softly. Rachel Carter watched the exchange with quiet emotion before placing a grateful hand on Cole's shoulder. "You gave my daughter a second chance today," she said. "I will never forget that." Cole shook his head gently. "Sometimes life gives us a moment where the right choice is the only one that matters. Tonight, everyone here JST showed P to honor that moment." Aaron them those sands of riders remained quietly gathered, their presence forming a living wall of loyalty and respect along the streets of the town. And in the center of it all stood the man who had dived beneath a moving TRCK, without hesitation, simply because a child needed someone to protect her. The evening air settled gently over the town as the long line of motorcycles continued to stretch along the quiet highway like a river of chrome under the streetlights. The earlier chaos of sirens and flashing emergency lights had faded into a calmer scene as investigators completed their work around the freight TRCK. The damaged braking system had already been carefully removed for examination, and officers continued to review the footage that led them to Victor Hale. Not long after the massive gathering of riders arrived, another message came through the police radio. Officers in the neighboring county had located the dark sedan connected to Hale. The vehicle had been found abandoned near a RAL storage building outside town. Shortly afterward, Victor Hale himself was taken into custody without resistance. When investigators questioned him, they uncovered the TRTH that had nearly turned the BSY intersection into a tragedy. Hale had spent years blaming the Hells Angels for the collapse of his business and the life he believed had been taken from him. When he saw the video of Cole Maddox riding through town earlier that afternoon, he recognized the patch on the biker vest immediately. In his anger, he loosened part of the braking system on the freight TRCK that had been parked temporarily at a nearby depot. Believing the delayed brakes would create an accident involving the biker he blamed for his downfall. What he had not expected was that a child would step into the street at the wrong moment. The TRTH left everyone quiet when the officers explained it later that night. Cole Maddox stood beside his motorcycle listening to the date while the rows of riders remained nearby. The older rider who had arrived first shook his head slowly. "Some grudges BRN long after they should have faded," he said. "BT today the road," answered in a different way. Emily Carter stood beside her mother watching the motorcycles that still filled the streets. The little girl looked at Cole again with the same bright curiosity she had shown since the moment he saved her. "Are you going to leave now?" she asked softly. Cole glanced at those sands of riders who had gathered in silent sport, and then back at the small town street where everything had changed in a single heartbeat. After a moment, he gave a gentle nod. "The road is always waiting," he said with a calm smile. "BT today reminded me why riders protect the people around them." Emily waved as Cole placed his helmet back on and started the engine of his motorcycle. One by one the riders around him followed, their engines rising together into the deep rolling thunder that had carried them there. As the long line of motorcycles slowly pled away from the town, the people watching from the sidewalks understood they had witnessed something rare. A moment when courage, loyalty, and the quiet bond of the open road came together to protect a child and remind everyone that sometimes a single brave decision can bring an entire brotherhood together.